I was a loving grandmother, the kind who spent a lifetime quietly saving money just to see her grandchildren's faces light up on Christmas morning. But one day, I discovered my savings had vanished, stolen by the very grandchildren I had cherished, so they could buy themselves new gadgets. The family only laughed, brushing it off, telling me I was too old to worry about money. They thought I would accept it. They thought I would stay silent. But instead, I decided to teach them a lesson. What did I do with their presents? Let's just say, my plan made them regret their betrayal and gave them a Christmas lesson they would never forget. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. I was 74 years old that crisp December morning in 2024, a retired school teacher named Margaret Alice Robinson, living in the small town of Willow Creek, Ohio, a place where the winters were long and the community tight-knit. My little house on Maple Street sat at the edge of town, a quaint two-story cottage with white shutters and a wraparound porch that I'd painted pale blue the summer before. I had always loved that house. It had been my sanctuary since my husband, Henry, passed away 10 years prior, leaving me with memories of our 40 years together and a quiet life to fill with new routines. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual, the soft light of dawn filtering through the lace curtains in my bedroom. I slipped into my favorite cardigan, a soft lavender one I'd knitted myself, and tied my gray hair into a loose bun. My joints ached a little as I descended the creaky wooden stairs, a reminder of my age, but I had always been stubborn about keeping active. The kitchen was my favorite room in the house, with its checkered linoleum floor and the old oak table Henry had built when we first moved in. I opened the curtains to let the pale winter light flood in, revealing the frost that clung to the window panes like delicate lace. I shuffled over to the counter and started my morning ritual, brewing a pot of coffee in the same percolator I'd used since the 1970s. The rich aroma filled the air as I pulled out a mixing bowl and began preparing dough for cinnamon rolls, a recipe I'd perfected over decades. Baking had always been my way of showing love, a tradition I'd carried over from my own grandmother, who taught me how to knead dough when I was just a girl. I could still hear her voice in my head, telling me to be patient, to let the dough rise slowly for the best results. As I worked, I hummed an old hymn, Silent Night, my fingers moving with the muscle memory of countless mornings, just like this one. On the wall above the sink hung a gallery of photographs, each one a snapshot of the life I'd built. There was a black and white picture of Henry and me on our wedding day in 1965, my veil fluttering in the breeze as we smiled at each other. Another photo showed our daughter, Linda, as a toddler, her chubby hands reaching for a daisy in our backyard. But the pictures I cherished most were of my grandchildren, Sophie, who was 15, and Jake, who was 13. In one photo, taken 3 summers ago at the county fair, Sophie had her arm around Jake, both of them grinning with cotton candy smeared across their cheeks. I had taken them on the Ferris wheel that day, their laughter echoing as we reached the top. The whole of Willow Creek spread out below us like a patchwork quilt. I paused my baking to run my fingers over that photo, my heart swelling with a familiar ache. Sophie and Jake had been the light of my life since the day they were born. I remembered the late nights I'd spent rocking them to sleep when Linda was too exhausted. The afternoons we'd spent in my garden planting sunflowers, their small hands digging into the soil beside mine. As a school teacher, I had always believed in the power of teaching through love and patience, and I'd poured that same energy into my grandchildren. I taught Sophie how to read using my old collection of Nancy Drew books, her eyes wide with wonder as we unraveled mysteries together. With Jake, I'd spent hours building model airplanes, his face lighting up each time we finished one, and hung it from his bedroom ceiling. But lately, things had changed. I couldn't quite put my finger on when it started, but Sophie and Jake had grown distant. They used to visit every weekend, bounding through my front door with stories about school and their friends. But now weeks would pass without a single call. I tried not to let it bother me. I knew teenagers were busy, caught up in their own worlds, but the silence stung more than I cared to admit. I missed their laughter, the way the house felt alive when they were here. I turned back to my dough, rolling it out on the counter with a wooden rolling pin that had belonged to my mother. I had been saving up for something special for Sophie and Jake this Christmas, a tradition I'd kept since they were little. Every year, I'd set aside a little money from my pension, tucking it away in an old biscuit tin I kept under my bed. This year, I had nearly $4,000 saved up, enough to buy Sophie a tablet she'd been eyeing at the mall and Jake a skateboard. I wanted this Christmas to be memorable, a way to remind them of the bond we shared, even if they seemed to be drifting away. As I sprinkled cinnamon and sugar over the dough, I glanced out the window at the snow-dusted garden. My sunflowers had long since wilted, but the bird feeder I'd hung on the oak tree was bustling with chickadees, their tiny wings fluttering as they pecked at the seeds. I smiled, thinking of how Jake used to sit on the porch with me, counting the birds and naming them, always something silly like Mystery Feathers or Captain Beak. Those memories felt so far away now, but I held on to them tightly, hoping this Christmas would bring us closer again. I slid the cinnamon rolls into the oven, the warmth filling the kitchen as I wiped my hands on my apron. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a steady rhythm that had kept me company through many lonely mornings. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, watching the steam rise in lazy curls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, a nagging worry that had been growing for weeks. But I pushed it aside, telling myself I was just being an old fool, worrying over nothing. I had no idea how wrong I was, or how that day would change everything. I had just finished cleaning up the kitchen that chilly December afternoon in 2024, the scent of freshly baked cinnamon rolls still lingering in the air of my small home. I had spent the morning preparing for what I hoped would be a memorable Christmas for my grandchildren. My hands, though wrinkled and a bit shaky with age, still moved with purpose as I wiped down the counter, my mind already turning to the next task on my list. I wanted to check on the savings I had been carefully setting aside for Sophie and Jake, my 15-year-old granddaughter and 13-year-old grandson, who had always been the center of my world. I made my way upstairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath my slippers as I climbed to my bedroom. The room was a cozy haven, with a patchwork quilt on the bed that I had sewn myself decades ago, and a small bookshelf filled with the classics I used to teach, books like To Kill a Mockingbird and Pride and Prejudice. I knelt beside the bed, wincing slightly as my knees protested, and reached underneath to pull out an old biscuit tin I had repurposed years ago as a safe for my savings. The tin was a faded silver, decorated with a faint floral pattern, and I had always kept it hidden there, a secret spot I thought no one would ever find. Inside were the $4,000 I had saved over the years, a little at a time, from my modest pension. I had been so proud of that money, imagining the joy on Sophie and Jake's faces when I surprised them with the gifts I had planned. A new tablet for Sophie, who loved drawing, and a skateboard for Jake, who had been begging for one since last summer. I lifted the lid of the tin, expecting to see the neat stack of bills I had placed there just a few weeks ago, but my heart stopped when I saw nothing but the cold, empty metal bottom staring back at me. My hands trembled as I turned the tin upside down, as if the money might somehow be hiding in a corner, but it was gone, every last dollar. I sat back on my heels, my mind racing with confusion and disbelief. I had always been so careful, never telling anyone about my hiding spot, not even my daughter, Linda, who was Sophie and Jake's mother. But then a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome, of the previous weekend when Sophie and Jake had come over under the pretense of helping me decorate the house for Christmas. I had been so happy to see them that day, their rare visit filling my quiet home with the sound of their footsteps and the faint buzz of their teenage energy. Sophie had been scrolling on her phone, her long brown hair falling over her shoulder as she sat on my couch, while Jake had been rummaging through the pantry, claiming he was looking for snacks. I had been in the living room, stringing lights on the small Christmas tree I had bought, when I noticed Jake wander upstairs for a moment. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. He often liked to explore the house, poking around in the attic or looking at the old model trains Henry and I used to collect. Sophie had even asked to borrow one of my recipe books, saying she wanted to try baking cookies for a school event, and I had happily obliged, pulling out my worn binder of handwritten recipes. They had stayed for a few hours, helping me hang a few ornaments before leaving abruptly, claiming they had plans with friends. I had waved them off from the porch, my heart warm with the hope that they were finally starting to reconnect with me. But now, as I sat on the floor of my bedroom with the empty tin in my lap, that warmth turned to ice. I realized with a sinking dread that they must have found the tin while I was distracted. The thought of my own grandchildren stealing from me felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I had raised them with love, spent countless afternoons reading to them, baking with them, teaching them right from wrong, or so I thought. I remembered the way Sophie used to curl up beside me on the couch, her head on my shoulder as I read her fairy tales, and how Jake would follow me around the garden, asking endless questions about the flowers. They had been such sweet children, but somewhere along the way, they had changed, and I hadn't wanted to see it until now. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky as I made my way to the phone on my nightstand. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I called Linda, my fingers fumbling with the buttons as I waited for her to pick up. When she finally answered, I could hear the noise of her busy household in the background, dishes clattering, the TV blaring, and I got straight to the point, asking if she knew anything about the missing money. There was a long pause on the other end, and then Linda sighed, her tone dismissive as she admitted that Sophie and Jake had taken the money. They had wanted new gadgets. Sophie had her eye on a pair of wireless earbuds, and Jake wanted a video game he'd been talking about for weeks. Linda brushed it off, saying they were just kids being kids, and that I shouldn't make a big deal out of it since I didn't really need the money anyway. She even suggested I could save up again next year, as if that erased the betrayal. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking not with age, but with a mix of anger and heartbreak. I walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered street, the Christmas lights twinkling on the houses across the way. Willow Creek had always been a place of warmth and tradition for me, but in that moment it felt colder than ever. I thought of the years I had spent teaching children the value of honesty, the countless lessons I had tried to instill in Sophie and Jake about gratitude and respect. I had given them so much, not just money, but my time, my love, my heart, and they had thrown it all away for a few shiny toys. I felt a tear slip down my cheek as I stood there, the empty tin still clutched in my hands, knowing that this betrayal would change everything. The evening after I discovered my stolen savings felt heavier than any I had experienced in my 74 years. I was Margaret Alice Robinson, a retired school teacher living in the quiet town of Willow Creek, Ohio, a place where I had built a life of love and tradition over decades. My small home on Maple Street, with its white picket fence and frost-kissed rose bushes, had always been a sanctuary, But that night, it felt like a hollow shell. The betrayal of my grandchildren, Sophie and Jake, who had taken the $4,000 I had saved for their Christmas gifts, left a wound in my heart that seemed to deepen with every passing hour. I needed to confront them, to understand why they had done this to me, but I also dreaded the thought of facing their indifference. I decided to call Sophie and Jake directly, hoping that hearing their voices might give me some clarity. I sat in my rocking chair in the living room, the same one I had rocked them in as babies, and picked up the old rotary phone that sat on the side table. My fingers hesitated as I dialed Linda's number, knowing that my grandchildren would likely be at her house, just a few streets away. When the call connected, I could hear the faint hum of their household in the background, Linda's radio playing country music, the clatter of dishes being washed. I asked to speak with Sophie first, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. When she came to the phone, I told her I knew about the money, that I had found the empty tin under my bed, and I asked her why she would do such a thing. I expected remorse, maybe even an apology, but instead I was met with a dismissive giggle that cut through me like a knife. She brushed off my words, saying I was too old to need money anyway, and that she and Jake deserved it more because they wanted new things for school. Before I could respond, she handed the phone to Jake, who echoed her sentiment, his tone casual as he told me I should just let it go because it wasn't a big deal. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling, feeling as though the children I had loved so fiercely had become strangers. The next day, I decided to face the family in person, hoping that seeing me might stir some guilt in them. Linda had invited me to a family dinner at her house, a weekly tradition we had kept for years, though I had been skipping the last few gatherings, feeling the growing distance between us. I bundled up in my heavy wool coat, the one with the red scarf Henry had given me on our 20th anniversary, and walked the short distance to Linda's house on Cedar Lane. The air was crisp, the sidewalks dusted with fresh snow, and the neighborhood glowed with Christmas lights strung along porches and wrapped around trees. Normally, the sight would have warmed me, reminding me of the many winters I had spent caroling with my students or decorating with my family. But that evening, I felt only a deep, aching loneliness. When I arrived at Linda's house, the warmth of her home contrasted sharply with the coldness I felt inside. The living room was crowded with relatives, Linda and her husband, Tom, my younger brother, Ed, and his wife, Clara, along with Sophie and Jake, who were sprawled on the couch, their eyes glued to their phones. The dining table was set with a red checkered tablecloth, and the smell of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes filled the air, a meal I had taught Linda to make when she was a teenager. I took off my coat and sat at the table, trying to muster a smile as I greeted everyone. But the weight of what had happened pressed down on me. I waited until we were all seated, the clinking of silverware against plates filling the silence, before I brought up the stolen money. I explained how much it had hurt me, how I had saved that $4,000 over years to give Sophie and Jake a special Christmas, and how their actions had broken my trust. I had hoped for understanding, for someone to take my side, but instead I was met with a wall of indifference. Linda sighed, stirring her mashed potatoes as she told me I was overreacting, that the kids were just being impulsive and that I should forgive them because they didn't mean any harm. Tom nodded in agreement, his eyes barely lifting from his plate as he muttered something about how teenagers make mistakes. Ed and Clara exchanged a glance. Then Clara reached over to pat my hand, her tone patronizing as she said I was being too sensitive, that I needed to move on because family was more important than money. Sophie and Jake didn't even look up from their phones, their fingers tapping away, as if I hadn't spoken at all. I felt a lump rise in my throat, my chest tightening with the realization that no one in this room cared about my pain. They had all chosen to side with the children, dismissing my feelings as if I were a foolish old woman who didn't matter. I left the dinner early, unable to bear the weight of their apathy any longer. I walked home through the snowy streets, the cold biting at my cheeks as tears welled in my eyes. The Christmas lights that had once brought me joy now seemed to mock me, their cheerful glow a stark contrast to the darkness I felt inside. When I reached my house, I went straight to the kitchen and sat at the table, staring at the empty biscuit tin I had left on the counter. I ran my fingers over its faded floral pattern, remembering the years I had spent filling it with love and hope for my grandchildren. I thought of the countless sacrifices I had made, skipping small luxuries like new clothes or a vacation so I could save for them, believing that they would appreciate the gesture. But now I saw the truth. My family had taken me for granted, and their betrayal was more than just the stolen money. It was the way they had turned their backs on me when I needed them most. I wiped away my tears, a flicker of resolve beginning to form in my heart, knowing that I couldn't let this go unchallenged. The morning after that disastrous family dinner in December 2024, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that wouldn't lift. I was Margaret Alice Robinson, a 74-year-old retired school teacher, living alone in my quaint home in Willow Creek, Ohio, a small town where the winters were harsh and the sense of community had once been my comfort. But now that comfort felt like a distant memory. My grandchildren, Sophie and Jake, had stolen the $4,000 I had saved for their Christmas gifts, and my family had dismissed my pain, leaving me feeling more isolated than I ever had in my life. I lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, the faded floral wallpaper, a reminder of happier times when my husband, Henry, and I had painted this room together. The ache of betrayal gnawed at me, but as the first light of dawn crept through the lace curtains, I knew I couldn't let this go. I had to do something. I pulled myself out of bed, my movements slow and deliberate, my joints protesting as I slipped into my worn housecoat and tied my gray hair into a loose bun. I shuffled downstairs to the kitchen, the heart of my home, where the air still carried the faint sweetness of the cinnamon rolls I had baked a few days earlier. The kitchen was my sanctuary, with its old oak table and the shelves lined with jars of homemade jam, each one labeled in my careful handwriting: strawberry, raspberry, peach. I had always found solace in this room, in the act of creating something with my hands, but that morning the space felt hollow. I brewed a pot of coffee, the familiar gurgle of the percolator the only sound in the quiet house, and sat at the table with a steaming mug, trying to make sense of the storm inside me. I couldn't stop thinking about the gifts I had bought for Sophie and Jake, the ones I had planned to give them on Christmas morning. They were stored in the hall closet, wrapped in bright red and green paper with little snowflake patterns, each package tied with a ribbon I had curled myself. I had spent weeks searching for the perfect presents: a sleek digital drawing tablet for Sophie, who had always loved art, and a high-quality skateboard for Jake, who had been begging for one after watching skaters at the park last summer. I had saved for years to afford those gifts, carefully setting aside small amounts from my pension, sacrificing little luxuries like new shoes or a trip to the city so I could see the joy on their faces. I had imagined their smiles, the way Sophie's eyes would light up when she saw the tablet, the way Jake would whoop with excitement as he tore open the wrapping to reveal the skateboard. But now those dreams felt tainted, poisoned by their betrayal. I stood up and walked to the closet, my slippers whispering against the hardwood floor. I opened the door and pulled out the two packages, setting them on the table in front of me. The sight of them brought a fresh wave of pain, but also a clarity I hadn't felt before. I realized that giving these gifts to Sophie and Jake would be like rewarding their behavior, as if their theft meant nothing, as if my feelings didn't matter. I had spent my career teaching children the importance of consequences, guiding them to understand right from wrong, and I couldn't let my own grandchildren escape that lesson. I had always believed in the power of love, but I also believed in justice, and I knew I had to act, not out of spite, but out of a need to reclaim my dignity and teach them something they would carry with them long after I was gone. I sat back down, the gifts still on the table, and took a sip of my coffee, the bitterness mirroring the taste in my mouth as I thought about my family's indifference. I remembered the way Linda had dismissed my hurt, the way Sophie and Jake had laughed off my pain, the way my brother and his wife had patronized me at the dinner table. I had given so much to this family, my time, my energy, my heart, and they had thrown it back in my face. I couldn't let that stand. I needed to do something that would make them see the weight of their actions, something that would show them I wasn't just a frail old woman to be taken advantage of. And then an idea began to form, one that felt both bold and right, a way to turn this betrayal into a lesson they wouldn't forget. I decided to sell the gifts. I wouldn't give Sophie and Jake the satisfaction of receiving what they clearly didn't deserve. Instead, I would take the money and donate it to a cause that mattered, a cause that would honor the values I had tried to instill in them: kindness, generosity, gratitude. I thought of the local children's shelter in Willow Creek, a place I had supported for years through bake sales and knitting drives. The shelter was always in need of funds, especially during the holidays, to provide warm clothes and toys for the children who had so little. I had visited the shelter many times, bringing blankets I had crocheted or cookies I had baked, and I knew how much even a small donation could mean to those kids. Selling the gifts would give me enough money to make a difference, and I could donate it in Sophie and Jake's names, a public gesture that would force them to face the consequences of their actions. I picked up the phone and called the shelter, my hands steady now as I spoke with the director, a kind woman named Ellen, who I had known for years. I told her about the gifts, a tablet worth $300 and a skateboard worth $150, and asked if they could help me sell them to raise funds for the shelter. Ellen was thrilled, saying they could auction the items at their upcoming holiday event, and she promised to send a thank you letter in Sophie and Jake's names, a detail I specifically requested. I hung up the phone, a sense of purpose settling over me like a warm blanket. I looked at the gifts one last time, running my fingers over the wrapping paper, and then placed them in a bag to drop off at the shelter later that day. For the first time since I had discovered the theft, I felt a spark of hope, a quiet strength that reminded me of the woman I had always been, one who didn't back down, who believed in doing what was right, even when it was hard. It was a brisk morning in mid-December 2024 when I set my plan into motion, a plan born from the pain of betrayal but fueled by a determination to reclaim my dignity. I was Margaret Alice Robinson, a 74-year-old retired school teacher living in Willow Creek, Ohio, a small town where the snow blanketed the streets and the air carried the scent of pine from freshly cut Christmas trees. My home on Maple Street, with its white shutters and frost-covered porch, had always been a place of warmth, but the recent actions of my grandchildren, Sophie and Jake, had left it feeling cold. They had stolen the $4,000 I had saved for their Christmas gifts, and after my family dismissed my hurt, I decided to sell the presents I had bought for them, a digital drawing tablet for Sophie and a skateboard for Jake, and donate the proceeds to a local children's shelter. I wanted them to learn a lesson, one that would sting but also teach them the value of gratitude and respect. I woke up early that morning, the sky still dark as I slipped into my warmest sweater, a soft gray one I had knitted years ago, and pulled on my heavy coat. My hands, though stiff with age, moved with purpose as I gathered the wrapped gifts from the hall closet where I had kept them. The packages were still pristine, their red and green wrapping paper adorned with snowflake patterns, the ribbons I had curled so carefully still intact. I placed them into a sturdy canvas bag, the weight of them a reminder of the love I had poured into choosing each one. I had spent weeks searching for the perfect gifts, imagining Sophie's delight at the tablet, which would let her draw the fantastical creatures she loved, and Jake's excitement over the skateboard, which he could use to race down the hill at the park. But now those dreams were gone, replaced by a resolve to turn this betrayal into something meaningful. I drove my old station wagon to the Willow Creek Children's Shelter, a modest brick building on the edge of town that I had supported for years. The shelter was a haven for children who had nowhere else to go, a place where I had often volunteered, bringing homemade cookies or knitted scarves to brighten their days. I parked in the small lot, the gravel crunching under my tires, and carried the bag inside, the cold air biting at my cheeks as I walked. The shelter was bustling with activity despite the early hour. Volunteers were setting up tables for their upcoming holiday event, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the playroom. I met with Ellen, the shelter's director, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile who I had known since my teaching days. I handed her the gifts, explaining my plan to sell them and donate the proceeds to the shelter. Ellen's face lit up with gratitude, and she assured me they could auction the items at their event that weekend, promising to send a thank you letter in Sophie and Jake's names, just as I had requested. The auction took place 2 days later, and I attended, sitting in the back of the shelter's community room as the event unfolded. The room was decorated with paper snowflakes and strands of tinsel, and a small Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights twinkling softly. I watched as the tablet and skateboard were presented to the crowd, the auctioneer describing them with enthusiasm while volunteers held them up for all to see. I felt a pang of sadness as I saw the gifts I had chosen with such care being passed to strangers, but that sadness was quickly replaced by a sense of purpose. The tablet sold for $320, and the skateboard went for $180, bringing in a total of $500 for the shelter. I smiled quietly to myself, knowing that the money would buy warm coats and toys for the children who needed them most. Children who would appreciate the kindness in a way my grandchildren had not. Back at home, I spent the next few days keeping myself busy, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of my routines. I pulled out my knitting needles and a skein of soft blue yarn, starting a new project, mittens for the shelter children. I sat by the window in my living room, the winter light casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, and worked steadily, my fingers moving with the muscle memory of countless projects. Outside, the snow fell gently, covering the garden where I had once planted sunflowers with Sophie and Jake, their small hands digging into the soil beside mine. I thought of those memories as I knitted, but I also thought of the letter that would soon arrive at Linda's house, the one thanking Sophie and Jake for their generous donation. I imagined their faces when they opened it, the confusion and frustration they would feel, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing they would finally face the consequences of their actions. I also baked a batch of gingerbread cookies, shaping them into little stars and decorating them with white icing, a task that filled my kitchen with the warm scent of molasses and spices. I packaged the cookies in small tins, tying each one with a red ribbon, and set them aside to bring to the shelter later that week. I wanted to do more, to give more, because helping the shelter children had reminded me of why I had become a teacher in the first place, to make a difference, to show kindness, to teach through love. I looked around my home, at the photographs on the walls and the Christmas tree I had yet to decorate, and felt a spark of hope. I was taking back control, turning my pain into something good, and as I knitted and baked, I began to feel a lightness I hadn't felt in days. I knew the hardest part was still ahead, the moment when Sophie and Jake would learn what I had done. But for now, I focused on the present, on the small acts of kindness that were healing my heart, one stitch, one cookie, one moment at a time. It was Christmas Eve 2024, and the air in Willow Creek, Ohio, was thick with the scent of pine and the glow of holiday lights that adorned every house on Maple Street, including my own. I was Margaret Alice Robinson, a 74-year-old retired school teacher, standing in my cozy living room, the weight of my recent decisions settling around me like the snow outside. My small home, with its white shutters and frost-kissed windows, felt quieter than ever, but I had found a new sense of purpose in the wake of my grandchildren's betrayal. Sophie and Jake, my 15-year-old granddaughter and 13-year-old grandson, had stolen the $4,000 I had saved for their Christmas gifts, and after my family dismissed my pain, I sold the presents I had bought for them, a digital drawing tablet for Sophie and a skateboard for Jake, donating the $500 I earned to the local children's shelter. I had requested a thank you letter be sent in their names, and now, as the holiday approached, I braced myself for the moment they would learn what I had done. I spent the morning preparing for their visit, knowing they would come expecting the gifts I had always given them. I decorated my small Christmas tree, a modest fir I had bought from the lot in town, stringing it with the same ornaments I had used for decades, glass baubles that shimmered in the light, tiny wooden angels I had painted with my late husband, Henry, and strands of silver tinsel that caught the glow of the fireplace. I set out a plate of sugar cookies I had baked the day before, their edges dusted with red and green sprinkles, and brewed a pot of hot cocoa, the rich aroma filling the kitchen. My home looked festive, but my heart was a tangle of emotions. Part of me longed for the Christmases of years past, when Sophie and Jake would race through my door, their laughter filling the house. But another part of me knew those days were gone. I had placed 2 envelopes on the coffee table, each containing the thank you letter from the shelter, addressed to Sophie and Jake, and I waited, my hands folded in my lap, for the inevitable confrontation. The clock struck 3 in the afternoon when I heard the crunch of tires on the snowy driveway, followed by the sound of car doors slamming shut. I stood at the window, watching as Sophie and Jake emerged from their mother Linda's minivan, their faces lit with expectation as they bounded up the porch steps. Linda trailed behind them, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, her expression one of mild impatience, as if this visit were just another item on her holiday to-do list. I opened the door to let them in, the cold air rushing into the warmth of my home, and stepped aside as they entered, their boots leaving small puddles of melted snow on the hardwood floor. Sophie tossed her coat onto the couch, her long brown hair spilling over her shoulders, while Jake kicked off his sneakers, his eyes already scanning the room for the familiar sight of wrapped presents. I watched them, my heart aching with a mix of love and disappointment, knowing they had no idea what was coming. I invited them to sit on the couch, the same one where I had read them stories when they were little, and handed each of them an envelope, my hands steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. I sat across from them in my rocking chair, the fire crackling in the background, and watched as they tore open the envelopes, their expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion to anger. The letters from the shelter thanked them for their generous donation, explaining how the $500 from the sale of the tablet and skateboard had been used to buy winter coats and toys for the children in need. Sophie's face flushed red, her brows knitting together in frustration, while Jake's jaw dropped, his hands crumpling the letter as he looked up at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. Linda, who had been standing near the doorway, stepped forward to read over their shoulders, her own expression darkening as she realized what I had done. The room erupted into chaos. the warmth of the holiday atmosphere shattered by their reactions. Sophie threw the letter onto the floor, her hands clenched into fists, her voice rising in a way that made my heart sink. She accused me of ruining their Christmas, saying I had no right to sell their gifts, that I was being cruel and unfair. Jake joined in, his tone sharp as he tossed his letter aside, claiming I had embarrassed them by donating in their names, that I should have just forgiven them because it wasn't a big deal. Linda's anger was quieter but no less cutting. She crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line, and told me I had gone too far, that I was punishing the kids for a mistake and making the whole family look bad. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, letting their words wash over me like a bitter wind, but I refused to let their anger shake me. I explained my reasoning, my voice calm but firm, as I looked each of them in the eye. I told them that they had stolen from me, not just money but my trust, and that I couldn't let that go without consequences. I reminded them of the years I had sacrificed to save that money, of the love I had poured into choosing those gifts, and how their actions had broken my heart. I said that the shelter children deserved the money more, that they would appreciate the kindness in a way Sophie and Jake clearly did not. I suggested they leave if they couldn't accept what I had done, my words hanging in the air like a challenge. Sophie stormed out first, grabbing her coat and slamming the door behind her, followed by Jake, who muttered something under his breath as he shoved his feet into his sneakers. Linda lingered for a moment, her eyes searching mine, but she said nothing more before following her children out into the snowy evening, the door closing with a soft thud that echoed in the now silent house. I sat back in my chair, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls, and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The plate of cookies sat untouched, the cocoa growing cold in its pot, and the Christmas tree lights seemed to glow a little dimmer. I felt a pang of sadness for the family I had lost, for the grandchildren who had once been my joy, but I also felt a quiet strength, a certainty that I had done the right thing. I had stood up for myself, something I hadn't realized I needed to do until that moment, and as I watched the snow fall outside, I knew that this Christmas, though painful, was the beginning of a new chapter for me. It was Christmas Day 2024, and the snow outside my window in Willow Creek, Ohio, sparkled under the pale morning sun, casting a serene glow over the quiet streets of my small town. I was Margaret Alice Robinson, a 74-year-old retired school teacher, sitting in my cozy home on Maple Street, a place that had once been filled with the laughter of my grandchildren, but had recently become a battleground for my dignity. My grandchildren, Sophie and Jake, had stolen the $4,000 I had saved for their Christmas gifts, and after my family dismissed my pain, I sold the presents I had bought for them, a digital drawing tablet for Sophie and a skateboard for Jake, donating the $500 I earned to the local children's shelter. I had faced their anger the night before, their accusations ringing in my ears, but as I woke up that morning, I felt a lightness in my heart, a sense of triumph that I hadn't expected to feel. I rose early, the house still quiet except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a steady rhythm that had kept me company through many solitary mornings. I slipped into my favorite robe, a soft blue one with tiny embroidered daisies, and made my way to the kitchen to brew a pot of coffee. The familiar ritual grounded me, the rich aroma filling the air as I looked out the window at my snow-covered garden. The bird feeder I had hung on the oak tree was bustling with chickadees, their tiny wings fluttering as they pecked at the seeds, and I smiled, remembering how I used to watch them with Sophie and Jake when they were younger. But those memories no longer brought the same pang of sadness. They were part of a past I was learning to let go of, a past I was determined to move beyond. I had decided to spend the day at the Willow Creek Children's Shelter, a place that had become a new source of joy for me in the wake of my family's betrayal. I gathered the tins of gingerbread cookies I had baked earlier in the week, each one carefully packed with star-shaped treats I had decorated with white icing, and placed them into a wicker basket. I also brought a small bundle of mittens I had knitted, their soft blue yarn warm and cozy, a gift for the children who had so little. I dressed warmly in my heavy wool coat and a knitted scarf, the cold air biting at my cheeks as I stepped outside and loaded the basket into my old station wagon. The drive to the shelter was short, the streets of Willow Creek quiet on Christmas morning, the houses glowing with holiday lights that seemed to wink at me as I passed. When I arrived at the shelter, the brick building was alive with activity, its windows adorned with paper snowflakes made by the children. I walked inside, the warmth of the space enveloping me as the sound of laughter and Christmas carols filled the air. The community room was decorated with a large Christmas tree, its branches heavy with handmade ornaments, and a long table was set up with hot chocolate and cookies for the children. I was greeted by Ellen, the shelter's director, who had become a dear friend over the years. She thanked me again for the donation, telling me how the $500 had bought winter coats for the children, ensuring they would be warm through the harsh Ohio winter. I set out my cookies and mittens on the table, watching as the children gathered around, their eyes wide with excitement as they each took a pair of mittens and a cookie, their small voices thanking me with a sincerity that warmed my heart. I spent the morning with the children, joining them in a game of charades and helping them string popcorn garlands for the tree. Their laughter was infectious, their joy a stark contrast to the coldness I had felt from my own family the night before. I sat with a little girl named Clara, who was 6 years old, her blonde curls bouncing as she showed me the drawing she had made of a snowman. I helped her glue on a tiny carrot nose, my hands steady as I worked, and I felt a peace settle over me, a peace I hadn't felt in weeks. These children, with their wide smiles and grateful hearts, reminded me of why I had become a teacher all those years ago, to make a difference, to bring light into the lives of those who needed it most. I realized that in giving to them, I had found a new family, one that appreciated my love in a way Sophie and Jake no longer did. When I returned home that afternoon, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the snowy landscape. I lit the fire in my living room, the flames dancing in the hearth as I settled into my rocking chair with a cup of tea. I felt a sense of accomplishment, a quiet triumph that came from knowing I had turned my pain into something good. The shelter children had given me a gift far greater than any I could have bought. They had given me purpose, a reason to keep going even after my family had let me down. I thought of Sophie and Jake, wondering if they would ever understand the lesson I had tried to teach them, but I no longer felt the need to prove myself to them. I had reclaimed my dignity, my strength, and as I watched the snow fall outside, I knew I was no longer the broken woman they had tried to make me feel like. I pulled a small notebook from the drawer of my side table and began to write, jotting down my thoughts about the day, about the children at the shelter, about the new path I was carving for myself. I wrote about the importance of standing up for oneself, of not letting betrayal define you, and as I wrote, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I looked around my home, at the Christmas tree with its twinkling lights, at the photographs on the walls that now seemed like relics of a different time, and I smiled. I had found a new kind of happiness, one that didn't depend on the approval of others, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly at peace, ready to face whatever the future might bring. It was the day after Christmas 2024, and a gentle calm had settled over Willow Creek, Ohio, the small town where I had lived for most of my 74 years. I was Margaret Alice Robinson, a retired school teacher, sitting in my cozy home on Maple Street, the snow outside my window glistening like a blanket of diamonds under the late morning sun. My house, with its white shutters and frost-kissed porch, had seen many Christmases, but this one had been different, marked by a journey of pain and triumph that had changed me forever. My grandchildren, Sophie and Jake, had stolen the $4,000 I had saved for their Christmas gifts, and after my family dismissed my hurt, I sold the presents I had bought for them, a digital drawing tablet for Sophie and a skateboard for Jake, donating the $500 I earned to the local children's shelter. I had faced their anger on Christmas Eve, but the day at the shelter on Christmas had filled me with a renewed sense of purpose. And now, as I sat by the fire, I reflected on the lessons I had learned and the new path I was determined to walk. I woke up that morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, the kind of clarity that comes from letting go of what no longer serves you. I slipped into my favorite house coat, a soft green one with tiny embroidered leaves, and made my way to the kitchen, my slippers whispering against the hardwood floor. The house was quiet, the only sound the crackling of the fire I had lit in the living room, its warmth spreading through the space like a comforting embrace. I brewed a pot of tea, chamomile with a hint of honey, and poured it into my favorite mug, a ceramic one painted with daisies that my late husband Henry had given me on our 30th anniversary. I carried the mug to the window and looked out at my garden, the snow covering the flower beds where I had once planted tulips with Sophie and Jake, their small hands eager to help as they dug into the soil. Those memories, once so precious, now felt like a chapter I was ready to close, a chapter that had ended with their betrayal, but had opened the door to something new. I decided to spend the day organizing my home, a task I had been putting off for months, but now felt compelled to tackle. I started in the living room, pulling down the old photographs that lined the walls, the ones that captured happier times with my family. There was a picture of Sophie at 5, her face smeared with chocolate as we baked cookies together, and one of Jake at 7, holding a model airplane we had built, his grin wide with pride. I had cherished those photos for years, but now they felt like reminders of a past I needed to let go of. I carefully placed them into a box, not out of anger, but out of a need to make space for the future. I replaced them with new photographs I had taken at the shelter the day before, snapshots of the children I had met, their smiles bright as they held the mittens I had knitted for them, their laughter captured in a moment of pure joy. I hung these new pictures on the wall, their presence a symbol of the new family I had found, a family that appreciated my love in a way my grandchildren no longer did. I moved to the kitchen next, pulling out my recipe book, a worn binder filled with handwritten notes I had collected over decades. I flipped through the pages, each one a memory of meals I had cooked for my family, pot roasts for Sunday dinners, pies for Thanksgiving, cookies for Christmas. But as I turned the pages, I realized I wanted to create something new, something that reflected the person I was becoming. I took a fresh sheet of paper and began writing a recipe for the gingerbread cookies I had made for the shelter children, adding a note about how their joy had inspired me. I decided I would make this a tradition, baking for the shelter every Christmas, a way to honor the lesson I had learned, that love should be given where it is valued, that kindness should be shared with those who appreciate it. I spent the afternoon knitting, my needles clicking rhythmically as I worked on a new scarf, this one a deep red, a color that reminded me of the holly berries that grew in my garden. I sat by the window, the winter light casting a soft glow over my work, and thought about the journey I had been on. I had spent so much of my life giving to my family, pouring my heart into my daughter Linda and my grandchildren Sophie and Jake, believing that love was enough to keep us connected. But their betrayal had shown me that love without respect was hollow, that I deserved better than to be taken for granted. I had taught children for decades the importance of integrity, of consequences, and I had finally applied that lesson to my own life. By selling the gifts and donating the money, I had stood up for myself, showing Sophie and Jake that their actions had consequences, that they couldn't treat me as if I didn't matter. As the sun began to set, I lit the candles on my mantel, their flickering flames casting a warm glow over the room. I sat in my rocking chair, the scarf I had been knitting draped over my lap, and looked at the new photographs on the wall. I thought of the children at the shelter, Clara with her blonde curls, little Tommy who had hugged me so tightly, the others whose names I was just beginning to learn. They had given me a gift far greater than any I could have bought, a sense of belonging, a reminder that I still had so much to give. I realized that this Christmas, though painful, had been a turning point for me, a chance to redefine what family meant, to find joy in new connections, to live on my own terms. I sipped my tea, the warmth spreading through me as I watched the snow fall outside, each flake a quiet promise of a fresh start. I knew that Sophie and Jake might never fully understand the lesson I had tried to teach them, that Linda might never see my side, but that no longer mattered. I had found my own peace, my own happiness, and as I sat there, surrounded by the glow of the candles and the warmth of the fire, I felt a quiet strength, a certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. This new path, paved with kindness and self-respect, was one I would walk with pride, and I knew that every Christmas from now on would be a celebration of the woman I had become.